Thank you for coming today.
Thank you for having me.
So could you start by introducing yourself to us?
My name is Erika Shaker. I am the Education Director at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives in Ottawa, which is an independent progressive research organization with offices across the country.
Great. Could you talk about maybe some of the research that you've done in education funding? I know that you published papers with David McDonald,
Yep.
and could you maybe describe some of the research that you've done in education?
Sure. The Education Project was initially set up to monitor corporate intrusion into public education, so corporatization, commercialism, sponsorship, privatization, but its mandate has expanded. It was founded in about 96, 97, and its mandate has expanded since then to look at things like standardized testing, education finance and higher education, tuition fees, privatization, individualism, the individualization of how we pay for public services like education at all levels, childcare, social justice education. So we take a really broad look. I would argue that a lot of that still falls under the umbrella of corporatization and privatization, but it also allows for a really spirited defense of the importance of well-funded public education as well.
Could you describe to us some of the findings? I know you've done some research on tuition, and you were looking across Canada at different tuition levels and basically kind of this changing of how universities are funded.
Yep.
Could you describe this kind of process? And I know your research covers between 1993 and 2012. Could you tell us about the trends in funding education through those times?
We started looking at post-secondary education and tuition fees, particularly in universities, about 4 years ago, and have done a series of reports to look at where, if current trends continue, we can expect tuition fees to be in that current fall, and then projecting forward 4 years, tuition fees and other compulsory fees, because of course there's still fees you have to pay even if they're not tuition fees, and of course compulsory fees are often far less regulated than tuition fees themselves are. So in order to provide a bit of background, we looked at how this trend had started, or at least when it started to accelerate. And certainly from 92, say to 2012, we've seen a massive withdrawal in the amount of public funding that goes towards university operating revenue, and right across the country, more in some provinces than in others, but it's still a fairly striking reduction, and a corresponding increase in the amount of university operating revenue that comes from tuition fees. So how much of the responsibility for funding post-secondary education has shifted from governments onto students and their families in the form of tuition fees increasing. Again, this isn't entirely across the board. There have been some fairly striking exceptions to this rule, but by and large, what it has meant is that since about 93, 94, tuition fees and other compulsory fees have effectively tripled on average across the country.
And what has this done to the quality of education?
Well, what it's done is it's made it far less public, first of all, again, depending on the province in which you live. And it's also resulted in just a real deficit in funding that goes towards just basic maintenance and upkeep of the school. We have a multi-billion-dollar deficit in deferred maintenance, much of which is actually required immediately, just to bring schools back up to the point where you don't try to hammer something into a wall and a big chunk of wall falls down. We've also seen, for example, universities who are both victims of this sort of cutback agenda, this austerity agenda, but also perpetrators of it, move towards a system where they are looking to compensate for a lack of sufficient public funding by taking it out of students in the form of additional compulsory fees, which can be added to, so you have fee on top of fee on top of fee. And there's very little, there is some move to regulate this, but not a lot, to moving towards hiring, instead of full-time professors and full-time educators, contract faculty who can be hired at much lower cost and in fact are barely, in some cases, making above poverty wages, if that. And we're just looking at far fewer investments in post-secondary education for where that core funding is required, and in addition to which, going more and more to the private sector to get more corporate donations, bequests, going after wealthy alumni to actually get more of that private targeted funding, which has done nothing to reduce tuition fees and make education more accessible for students across the board.
So here's an argument that's been made by students, especially in Quebec, is that we actually need user fees, and it's up to the individual to pay for their education, and they're basically paying for their value. How would you address that?
I absolutely agree that we should pay for education. I believe that we should pay fully and for the full cost. I don't think that it's ever been an issue that students don't want to pay for their education. I think the debate is when they pay for it and how they pay for it. Do you pay for it publicly through the tax system, which of course ensures that you graduate, you get a job, you pay more in taxes, it goes back into the general pot, and we fund those social programs, universities, colleges, schools, hospitals, that everybody benefits from collectively? Or do we download it onto individuals, force them to pay for it privately, which can mean that some individuals, the lower income and middle income individuals, have to take on significant debt loads in order to do so, and then have to pay it back again through the public system, because the public tax system, because of course they're still going to do that, but then also pay for it privately. So it's not a question of nobody wanting to pay their fair share, it's just whether or not people should pay for it twice, depending on when they can pay for it, whether or not they can bear the interest that's going to be charged if you can't pay it off immediately because your parents aren't wealthy enough or you're not independently wealthy enough, or do we actually share the risk and all of us share in the benefit of a generation graduating with a degree and not deeply in debt as a result of that degree.
People in Quebec have said, or even statistics show, that Quebec actually pays less tuition than most other provinces in Canada. So some of the arguments that are brought forward is that Quebec doesn't pay its fair share. And I'm wondering if you could address that.
First of all, it is true that Quebec has low tuition fees for in-province students. It's about 3 times more if you go to university in Quebec and you're from outside of Quebec. Actually, when additional compulsory fees are factored in, Quebec does not have the lowest fees. It is Newfoundland and Labrador that has the lowest fees now. And it bears mentioning that they have embraced low tuition fees on a universal basis. They do not have a 2-tier structure, as Quebec and a number of other provinces have moved towards. I would argue that students in Quebec do pay their fair share. They have just opted through low tuition fees to pay their fair share through the public system. Again, I think we need to remember that when tuition fees are high, students are going to be pay back the cost of their education through the public system, and then paying it back again in the form of the private debt that they have incurred as a result of user fees or tuition fees being downloaded onto them.
So what would you consider then the most ideal model for universities to receive funding?
Oh, definitely through the public system. It's the most equitable, the most efficient, the fairest way, and it also ensures that all students benefit, and that we all share in the risks and in the rewards, because it is true that depending on the income or the salary that you're going to make after you graduate from university, and of course this also just assumes or presumes that the only reason you go to university is to get a job and then to pay more in taxes, which is of course not the case. We all benefit from living in a highly educated society that's not deeply indebted as a result. We know that statistically, if you have access to post-secondary education, you're more likely to be civically engaged, you're more involved in your community. If you're a parent, you tend to read more to your children, you tend to be healthier. I mean, these are all the things that come as a result of living in an educated society, and we all benefit from that. There are, of course, economic returns to the investment we make in our post-secondary education and ensuring that students have access to that education system. But not all students are going to benefit in a private market the same way. Some students are going to make more, some students are going to make less. And if we only judge education based on how much money you make when you graduate, we're going to be missing out on all the nuances of a well-rounded society that really appreciates and benefits from artists and librarians and childcare workers who don't necessarily make the salaries that doctors and architects and engineers make. So I think it's really important to recognize that this is about creating a well-educated and well-rounded society, not just graduating people who are going to make the greatest amount of money, although that does factor into the economic returns as well.
So what kind of changes happen when corporations come in and basically become more prevalent in the funding of universities?
Well, what we have seen is just campuses start looking different. You have more of a corporate presence on campus. You have banners corporate banners in what were once considered just public spaces. You have entire buildings named after companies. You have, in some cases, corporations, depending on the amount of money they give and the deal that is signed with the university, having a significant say in the curriculum that it's taught. One instance at the University of Toronto, because of a fairly significant corporate sponsor, students were actually not allowed to use the front door of one of the buildings on campus. That privilege was reserved for the donors and the important people. Students were actually told to go in through a side door. So you actually are seeing campuses that are just generally less public. And in fact, one of the administrators at York University, also in Toronto, a number of years ago, referred to York as a private institution that receives some public funding. So you're actually seeing universities moving away from referring to themselves as public entities. Sadly, that's not inaccurate. And just in the sheer amount of corporate money that comes in and the sheer amount of money that is provided in the form of tuition fees from students, which is also private money.
So what do you think should be the role of corporations in public institutions?
I think corporations should absolutely be involved in ensuring that our educational institutions have the funding that they need. I just think they should do it through the tax base like everybody else, because that is the way to ensure that it is fair, that it's accessible, that strings are not attached, and that the ultimate entity to which the university needs to answer to is the public, all the public.
I know you've also done research on daycare systems. So maybe could you explain a little bit about the research and the findings that you've encountered?
Well, what we do know, I mean, outside of Quebec, obviously, because Quebec does have a fairly unique system that has made childcare much more accessible and much more affordable to a much greater swath of the population, and has reaped the rewards of that, I should add. Again, the return on investment in childcare has been profound and indicates that the system more than pays for itself, which is important to remember. But across the rest of the country, it is much more patchwork, much more expensive, and much less predictable. It's a market-based system. And as a result, you have people paying upwards of $800 to $1,000 a month for a spot. And currently, we have 500,000 kids in Canada with 2 working parents and no daycare spot at all available. What governments, and of course, you know, childcare is one of universal childcare, national childcare system that's been promised for decades, and it still has yet to materialize, even though governments have promised again and again and again. What we recently have had implemented is something called the universal childcare benefit, which has just been enhanced, and a number of other sort of boutique tax credit programs, like activities and clubs. You can get some sort of a tax credit back, but you also have to spend the maximum in order to get a very minimal tax credit back in return. So it actually, you're not that much further ahead, and it also suggests that you have to make a lot of money to be able to spend a lot of money to be able to recoup a little bit of money. There's also the new family income tax package, otherwise known as income splitting, which only a very specific type of family can benefit from, and it certainly does not provide those benefits equitably. So these programs, first of all, are not a childcare program. The UCCB does not create a single childcare spot. It is not an effective or an efficient way of ensuring that people who need money get the money, because of course everybody gets the money from birth right up to 17 years old. So it could be helping to pay for a 17-year-old's driving lessons, but it's certainly not helping to pay for their childcare. One of my colleagues did some interesting calculations which indicated that when you take the enhanced UCCB and what that costs to the public purse and combine it with income splitting and what that costs to the public purse, what it suggests is that all of Canada is in fact paying for what it would cost to have $7 a day childcare. It's just that Quebec is the only province that's getting it, because these things don't create childcare. UCCBs, tax credits, these kind of handouts, they don't create childcare. It's policy that creates childcare. And until we actually have policy that addresses this issue and the tremendous need that's required to support the families and what families look like today, single parent families, double, 2 working parent families, we're not going to get the program that we need. And that will actually improve us all as a society, because it will allow families to achieve their potential, and it's something that's been proven to be really good for kids.
So how would we go about then making an ideal funding system for daycares?
Well, it does require a fairly significant public investment up front, absolutely, but we're also looking at creating a new workforce, hopefully with decent wages, which again is good for communities. Childcare is much as schools are community hubs. They're things that actually enrich a community. They bring people together. They do provide an opportunity to invest economically in a community as well. They create a stable, not precarious workforce. They can feed effectively into a school system, for example. So there's sort of a much greater synergy between these two systems that don't need to be separate. And ultimately, as we've seen in Quebec, these programs pay for themselves financially, but also, the social return on this investment is tremendous. So, we can certainly look at where money is being spent through income splitting in the UCCB, and we can take that and we could actually put it towards a well-funded system and get those spots on the ground out to families who need them, so people can actually, take advantage of a system that we're in desperate need of. But we can also rejoice in the fact that this is good for us. It's good for us economically, it's good for us socially, and frankly, we can't afford not to do it. We're at that much of a crisis point now that we cannot afford not to address it with policy, with good policy, not with handouts, and certainly not with boutique tax credits.
Could you describe to us what austerity means?
What I think is interesting is that austerity really has been, it's a new word, or not necessarily a new word, but the most recent way of describing a trend that involves governments reducing their level of commitment and public support, fiscal support as well, for programs and policies that were once considered very much in the public interest, and downloading that responsibility onto individuals and their families. So we've seen it called the common sense revolution in Ontario, for example, with the Mike Harris years. It's often referred to as just plain straight up neoliberalism. Some people just call it, capitalism. We're calling it austerity. And we've seen a number of governments, certainly nationally, but also provincially, embracing it. I understand that, you're in the midst of dealing with a government that's quite enamored with austerity budgets right now. We're seeing that happen in Newfoundland and Labrador, which is actually quite interesting because, of course, this has been a province that has, in spite of previous difficult economic times before the oil, the oil revenues really came online, put a tremendous amount of money into post-secondary education, recognizing that this was going to cost at the outset, but that the returns again would be tremendous, and that it was actually a really effective anti-poverty measure. So this explained their commitment at that point. We'll see if that commitment gets maintained. They've done some interesting things with regard to replacing the provincial student loans with need-based grants, which is great. But we'll see if the austerity flu is contagious when it comes to all other social programs that they have in Newfoundland and Labrador.
I could probably talk about this for a long time, but I know we're going to eventually have to give a speech. So I guess, I don't know, is there anything that you want to say before we conclude?
No, this has been great. I'm looking forward to tonight.
Yeah, wonderful. Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.